It all started with something so small and seemingly petty that most people wouldn't have believed it could spiral into an all-out war. But when you live in a neighborhood ruled by a homeowners association and an entitled, self-proclaimed queen bee named Karen, even the smallest detail becomes fuel for her drama. And in my case, that detail was my trash can. My name's David, and I had recently moved into what I thought was going to be my dream home by the lake, a quiet escape from the chaos of city life, where I could finally enjoy the peace and solitude I'd worked my whole life for. But instead, I walked straight into a battlefield where the rules of the HOA were interpreted not by fairness, not by bylaws, but by whatever mood Karen happened to be in that day. She was the type of neighbor who prowled around with her phone camera ready, snapping pictures of people's lawns if the grass dared to be a half-inch too long, or writing anonymous complaints when she saw kids riding bicycles too fast on the cul-de-sac. But her favorite target quickly became me, perhaps because I was new and therefore not yet conditioned to bow down to her authority, or perhaps simply because she thrived on confrontation and I refused to engage her the way she wanted. My trash can sat at the end of my driveway every Tuesday morning for pickup, just like everyone else's, and yet, without fail, I'd come home from work and find it tipped over, the contents spilled out into the street, sometimes even dragged halfway across the cul-de-sac as if someone had gone out of their way to make a mess. At first, I thought it was raccoons or maybe a teenager playing pranks, but when I checked my newly installed security camera footage, there she was, Karen, in broad daylight, striding down the street in her bright floral sundress, glancing left and right like a cartoon villain, and then giving my trash can a deliberate shove with both hands before walking off with that smug little smirk plastered on her face. She'd even mutter things under her breath, like eyesore or learn the rules, as if I'd committed some grand crime by putting my can out at the same time as literally every other homeowner. The first time I confronted her, she denied it, of course, her wide blue eyes blinking innocently as she said, "Oh, David, are you sure it wasn't the wind?" Never mind that the footage showed her in broad daylight, with not so much as a breeze in the air. The HOA board, of course, was no help. Karen had been on the board for years, and her cronies covered for her at every turn, dismissing my complaints as unsubstantiated or personal disputes, and even going so far as to threaten me with fines for placing my trash receptacle in view too early, a rule they conveniently never enforced with anyone else. It became a weekly humiliation ritual, me coming home to find my garbage strewn across the street, having to gather it up like some defeated servant, while Karen watched smugly from her porch as if she'd won another battle in a war only she was fighting. But here's the thing about me. I may be patient, but I'm not weak, and I believe in fighting fire with fire, or in this case, garbage with ingenuity. And the day I decided I was done being her victim was the day I started planning the trap that would not only stop Karen from knocking over my trash can, but would also expose her in a way she could never deny. And let me tell you, she definitely didn't see it coming. Once I decided enough was enough, I knew I couldn't just retaliate with childish pranks. Karen thrived on drama, and if I stooped to her level without proof or strategy, she'd spin the narrative and make it look like I was the aggressor. So instead, I spent the next 2 weeks quietly setting up what I started to call Operation Trash Queen. My first step was upgrading my home security system. Not just one camera, but three, each positioned at different angles, covering my driveway, the street, and the side yard where Karen sometimes lurked. I even installed one inside a fake birdhouse at the corner of my property for a close-up view of her antics, all with motion detection so I wouldn't have to sift through hours of footage. But video evidence alone wasn't enough. Karen had already proven she could talk her way out of anything by manipulating the board and gaslighting neighbors into thinking she was the victim. What I needed was not just footage, but something so undeniable, so humiliating, that she couldn't possibly squirm her way free. That's where the trash can itself came into play. I bought a brand new heavy-duty receptacle, the kind with reinforced wheels and a locking lid, and then I got creative. Using a little help from my brother-in-law, who happened to be an electrician, I rigged the can with a harmless but startling surprise, a pressurized air horn system that would trigger whenever the can was tipped beyond a certain angle. The setup was ingenious, disguised wires running through the base, a small battery pack tucked underneath, and the horn itself hidden inside the lid, so that the moment Karen pushed it like she always did, she'd be blasted with a deafening shriek that would not only startle her, but draw the attention of the entire block. To add icing to the cake, I also installed a small dye pack, the kind used in bank security bags, that would burst on impact, spraying a harmless but very visible bright blue stain across anything within a 3-foot radius. It was washable, non-toxic, but humiliating as hell, and the perfect marker to prove exactly who had been meddling with my property. Every detail had to be perfect, because I knew Karen would try to twist it no matter what happened. But the beauty of my setup was that she would literally be caught blue-handed, with the whole thing captured from 3 different angles in high definition. For days, I could barely sleep, anticipating the moment it would all play out, and sure enough, the following Tuesday arrived right on schedule. I placed my new can at the end of the driveway like always, locked the lid, and went to work with a mix of nerves and excitement twisting in my gut. Around 11 a.m., the alert started pinging on my phone. Motion detected. I pulled up the feed and there she was, Karen, wearing her oversized sunglasses and carrying her little morning walk water bottle like she always did when she went out snooping. She paused at the edge of my driveway, glanced around, and then, like clockwork, strode right up to the can and gave it her usual shove. What happened next was pure, glorious chaos. The moment she tipped it, the air horn blared so loudly she nearly jumped out of her sandals, stumbling back with her hands over her ears. And then, pop, the dye pack exploded, coating her sundress, her arms, even her perfect blonde bob with splatters of bright blue paint that looked like an ink bomb had gone off. She screamed, not just in shock, but in rage. And as if that wasn't enough, the noise brought half the neighborhood out of their houses, people on porches, kids peeking from windows, even a few of her fellow board members standing there with slack jaws as they watched their queen, screeching and flailing like a cartoon villain caught red, or rather blue-handed. I was watching it all unfold live on my phone, grinning ear to ear, knowing that the footage I'd captured was about to flip the entire balance of power in the neighborhood because Karen had just walked right into the trap she thought only she could set. The fallout from Trash Can Tuesday, as the neighborhood kids started calling it, was immediate and deliciously chaotic. Karen tried to storm back to her house, screeching about vandalism and traps and attempted assault. But the problem was she couldn't escape the evidence. Her sundress stained like a tie-dye project gone wrong, her hands dripping blue, and the sound of the air horn still echoing in people's ears. By the time she reached her porch, 3 of her fellow HOA board members had already approached her, demanding to know what had happened, and she did what Karen always did. She lied. "David set me up. He's targeting me. He's dangerous," she shouted, pointing at my driveway like I'd just committed a crime. But then one of the neighbors, an older gentleman named Tom, who had dealt with Karen's nonsense for years, stepped forward and said flatly, "Karen, we all saw you knock it over. He didn't come near you. You did it yourself." That single sentence sent a ripple through the crowd, because everyone knew Karen was manipulative, but rarely did anyone openly call her out. And I could see in the faces of my neighbors that something had shifted. Still, I wasn't about to let her spin this into another tale of victimhood. That evening, once I got home, I called an emergency HOA meeting. Yes, I had that right as a homeowner under the bylaws, though Karen had always counted on no one reading them closely enough to know. And when everyone gathered in the clubhouse, I walked in with a laptop, plugged it into the projector, and pressed play. The room went silent as the footage rolled, Karen striding up to the can, glancing around like a burglar, giving it a shove, and then the glorious explosion of chaos as she was blasted with the horn in dyed blue. 3 angles, crystal clear audio, undeniable evidence. She tried to interrupt, of course, shouting, "This is entrapment. This is harassment." But the board members silenced her for once, telling her to sit down until the video finished. When the lights came back on, I didn't even have to say much. The room spoke for me. Neighbors whispered, board members exchanged uneasy glances, and Karen sat fuming, arms crossed, her stained dress a reminder that the evidence was more than digital. I stood and said simply, "For months, my trash can has been tipped over and my property tampered with. I've filed complaints. I've been ignored. This is the person responsible. I think it's time we stop pretending otherwise." The vote that followed was nothing short of historic. Karen was officially censured by the board, stripped of her authority to issue fines, and suspended from her position pending further review. The smug smirk she always wore was gone, replaced by a mask of fury she could barely contain. And for once, she had no comeback. But I wasn't done, not by a long shot, because while the public humiliation and suspension were satisfying, I knew Karen's pattern. She'd lie low, lick her wounds, and then come back twice as vindictive. If I wanted this to end for good, I needed to dismantle her power entirely, not just embarrass her. So I began digging deeper into HOA bylaws, into board election procedures, even into financial records. And the more I uncovered, the clearer it became that Karen had not only been abusing her authority for years, but had been misusing HOA funds in ways that bordered on criminal. My little trash can war had just opened the door to something much bigger, and I was ready to walk right through it. Over the next month, I dedicated myself to peeling back every layer of the rotten empire Karen had built. And what I found was worse than I could have imagined. She wasn't just an overbearing busybody, she had essentially turned the HOA into her personal piggy bank and weapon of control. The financial records, which I obtained after formally requesting them as my right under state law, told a damning story. Thousands of dollars in miscellaneous expenses that conveniently lined up with her personal projects, like the new deck she had installed last summer or the elaborate landscaping that appeared only on her property. There were also suspicious charges to contractors that didn't exist, kickbacks from bogus maintenance fees, and fines she had levied on residents that were never deposited into the HOA's account, but instead mysteriously disappeared. Armed with this evidence, I reached out to my cousin, who happened to be a CPA, and together we built a detailed report tracing every irregularity. At the same time, I quietly rallied my neighbors, many of whom were eager to see Karen dethroned, but had been too intimidated to act. With the proof in hand and the community behind me, I scheduled a full HOA board meeting, this time inviting not just the residents, but also a representative from the county's housing authority, and most importantly, a state investigator I had tipped off about the financial mismanagement. The night of the meeting was electric. Karen arrived late, clearly rattled, and tried to reclaim her usual dominance, banging her gavel and sneering at me from across the table. But the moment I began presenting the evidence, her confidence began to crack. Slide after slide, receipt after receipt, I laid out the trail of theft, corruption, and abuse, each one punctuated by gasps from the audience and murmurs of outrage. Karen's face turned pale, then red, then pale again, and when the state investigator finally spoke, announcing that an official audit and criminal inquiry would be launched, she completely lost her composure, shouting that it was all lies, that I had fabricated everything, that this was nothing but a vendetta. But her words fell flat, drowned out by the collective fury of the community she had tormented for years. By the end of the meeting, the board voted unanimously to remove her from her position, effective immediately, and the investigator escorted her out of the building in front of everyone. The mighty queen of the HOA had finally been toppled, not by a rebellion of chaos, but by the very rules and laws she had twisted for so long. And as she was led away, still stained faintly blue from the dye that hadn't completely washed out, I couldn't help but feel a surge of poetic justice. She had started this war over a trash can, and now she was the one being thrown out like garbage. The chaos that erupted after Karen's trash can obsession finally turned against her reached a boiling point, but the fallout wasn't the kind she ever expected, nor was it something I thought would escalate so far beyond a petty feud over garbage. By the time the dust settled, Karen wasn't just embarrassed. She was ruined in ways that even the most vindictive neighbor couldn't have scripted, because the smart trash can I installed, a reinforced, a motion-triggered lock designed specifically to deter vandals like her, had not only caught her red-handed in high definition multiple times, but also logged each incident with timestamps, video uploads to cloud storage, and automatic alerts to the HOA board's compliance server, meaning that every single time she knocked my can over, spat on it, spray painted it, or dragged it into the street like a toddler throwing a tantrum, she was a sin. When presented at the next HOA board meeting, turned the smug queen of petty control into the laughingstock of the entire neighborhood. The meeting itself was something of a spectacle because Karen strutted in, expecting to accuse me of harassment or accuse me of provoking her with what she called an aggressive trash receptacle. But instead, the president of the board, clearly fed up with the dozens of complaints that had been piled high, went silent except for Karen's own shrill voice echoing in surround sound as she screamed at an inanimate object, tripped over herself in the dark, and, in one particularly glorious moment, managed to spray herself in the face with her own can of pink paint after the motion-locked lid resisted her attempts to pry it open. If humiliation were an Olympic sport, she had just one gold on the big screen in front of 50 of her. Everyone that under the HOA's own bylaws, willful destruction of another member's property carried escalating fines, suspension of voting rights, and even possible liens if not resolved. And since the camera log showed 73 incidents in the past 90 days, the math added up quickly. $250 per offense, totaling more than $18,000 in fines, not including restitution for damages, and the fact that they show is all evading restitution for damages, and the fact that bad another $18,000 in fines, not including restitution for damages, and the fact that $18,000 in fines, not including restitution for damages, and the fact that ended up quickly. Lid, her face went pale, her lips trembled, and she tried to bluster her way out by yelling that I baited her, that the trash can itself was entrapment. But the attorney sitting in the back row, someone she didn't realize was on retainer for the HOA board, stood up and calmly explained that tampering with another homeowner's personal property was no different from vandalism or trespassing, and that, if I so chose, I could put it on faith. Wasn't done making a fool of herself, because as soon as the meeting adjourned, she stormed outside, tried to kick the trash can one last time in some desperate display of dominance, and was promptly greeted by its motion-triggered locking system blaring a loud siren that I had installed earlier that week as an upgrade, which not only scared her so badly she tripped and fell into the bushes, but also triggered the local police response I had. With her countless false calls against me in the past, showed up in under 10 minutes, smirking when they saw who the culprit was this time. Needless to say, they didn't arrest her. They simply wrote up another incident report, shook my hand, and made it clear that if she didn't stop harassing me, the next call wouldn't be a warning, it would be a summons. But the cherry on top came a week later when the HOA sent out their monthly newsletter. HOA sent out their monthly newsletter. Notices and updates, but this time contained a special section labeled Ongoing Violations and Enforcement Actions, in which Karen's name was listed first in bold letters outlining her fines, her suspension from the board, oh yes, she was a board member, though not for long, and the fact that her repeated actions were under review for potential civil escalation. Suddenly, the woman who strutted around the cul-de-sac with an A by the very people she once bullied and laughed at behind closed doors whenever someone muttered the phrase smart trash can, which had now become an inside joke in the neighborhood. As for me, I couldn't have been happier with how it all played out. Not only had my plan worked perfectly, but it had also exposed Karen for exactly who she was, a petty tyrant undone not by a rival neighbor's scheming, but by her own inability to control her own inability to control she. Ability to control he. I can say my she built he peeves with, but by her own inability to control hate free she. When, in the end, she tried to sue me, of course, claiming I had intentionally weaponized my trash can to humiliate her. But the judge tossed the case almost immediately after reviewing the footage, calling it a masterclass in self-incrimination and ordering her to pay my attorney's fees on top of her own. Watching her storm out of the courthouse red-faced, muttering under her breath, was a moment I'll never forget. Because it symbolized a moment I'll never forget. Because it symbolized in self-incrimination. Because it symbolized I'll never forget. Because it symbolized in self-incrimination, because it symbolized in self-kenkai. But for everyone who had ever lived under her thumb, and as I wheeled my indestructible, gleaming smart trash can back to the curb the next week, hearing the quiet chuckles of my neighbors as they passed by, I knew one thing for certain. Sometimes the best revenge doesn't come from fighting fire with fire, but from letting someone like Karen burn themselves down on their own, all while the rest of us sit back and enjoy the show.